Hello everyone, I hope all of you golden wonders out there are doing good. Welcome to Lord Pog Gaming, and I'm your humble host, Lord Pog. You truly honor me with your presence, and before we get started, first let me do the thing here. If I got you feeling a type of way, then you'd honor me by liking and sharing the video. If you're new to my little corner of YouTube, then feel free to subscribe.
Your daisy if you do.
If and it tickle your fancy, of course. You can't imagine how much it does for me when y'all do this. It just means the world. Plus, don't forget to sign my guest book, as that's what I call my comment section, and ring my bell for notifications. Okay, that's enough of my shameless plugs. I'm not gonna harp on it, as that's not my style.
Well, I don't like to harp on a subject,
I don't care. It comes with me, never have. That's why they call me gregarious.
As promised to those of you who have been keeping up with my retro game reviews, or my R&Rs as I call them. Normally R&R stands for rest and relaxation, but I mean it to stand for retro reviews. However, you're more than welcome to sit a spell, take a load off, Benny, and rest and relax here. I've been doing this 4-part series of R&Rs on what I feel are the 4 best RPGs ever released on the Sega Genesis. They aren't in any particular order, like from least to greatest, as I've already reviewed my all-time favorite, Shining Force: The Legacy of Great Intention, which I'll leave a card for here if any of you golden wonders out there want to check it out. Plus, I've done Beyond Oasis, which I'll leave a card for here. And so, I've already reviewed 2 out of the 4 games that I plan on reviewing. And to be honest, I've gotten sidetracked and done some other videos before getting to this one that I'm about to do, which can be found on my channel, so feel free to browse around if you like. Or you don't have to if you don't want to. But seriously,
Do it.
folks who've been keeping up with this particular R&R series have been waiting for a hot minute, and I'm sorry it took so long, but finally it's time to review an all-time fan favorite, Landstalker: The Treasures of King Knoll.
I made you some content. Daddy made you your favorite open wide.
Which I know a lot of you had to see coming, as in some of the comments on my previous R&Rs, Landstalker was mentioned as one of the best Sega RPGs. I admittedly had to downplay this, of course, in my response, because I didn't want to give anything away. But just so you all know, to everyone out there, yes, it's one of my favorites also, and I've always planned on Landstalker being on this list. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. First released in Japan in 1992, then everywhere else in 1993, Landstalker: The Treasures of King Knoll was developed by Climax Entertainment, a small company who by '96 had a staff you could count on your fingers and toes. Yet this is the second game they were involved with on this list, as they were also responsible for developing Shining Force. Not to mention Shining Force's predecessor, Shining in the Darkness, along with Lady Stalker, Dark Savior, and Time Stalkers, each with their own varying degrees of success and failures. But aside from Shining in the Darkness and Shining Force, Landstalker perhaps was Climax Entertainment's biggest success, and for good reason, which we'll get into soon enough. Sadly though, in 2015, Climax would close its doors for good without so much as a whimper. Now I've looked into why their closure was so low-key, but unfortunately I haven't found anything other than financial issues being their reason for closing. If any of you golden wonders out there know why it wasn't publicized more, then let me know in the guest book, as I am genuinely curious.
Inquiring minds want to know.
Despite their eventual closure, Climax Entertainment developed a truly special game in Landstalker, which would be published by Sega for the Genesis. The magazine Game Fan, a publication started in 1992 by Tim Lindquist, Greg Off, George Weissing, and David Halvorson, perhaps, gave Landstalker a perfect 10 out of 10, saying at the time if it were an American version that they had played, they would have given it Game of the Year. So not too shabby if I do say so myself. Next Generation, a magazine geared more towards focusing on the industry of gaming rather than focusing on the games as single entities, claimed that Landstalker was so popular in Japan that folks there were buying the Mega Drive system just to play it. And that ain't no small feat, really. So needless to say, Climax had lightning in a bottle.
I got that, dog. Lightning in a bottle. Blip.
With Landstalker. The story of Landstalker, The Treasures of King Noel, was ahead of its time narratively and mechanically. The player is first introduced to an elf boy named Nigel. Granted, I'm not entirely sure he's a boy, but I know he's definitely young. Despite Nigel's age, he's an accomplished treasure hunter, as the game literally begins at the tail end of one of Nigel's hunts. This serves to show the player how competent Nigel is at what he does.
I'm the best there is at what I do, but what I do isn't very nice.
While showcasing some of the platforming the player has to look forward to. We'll get more into the platforming in the gameplay section, but for now, put a pin in it to come back to later.
Hold your horses.
After finishing up the aforementioned treasure hunt in the Gypta ruins, Nigel is instantly thrusted into a whole new ordeal while handing over the Gypta statue to a shop owner who hired him. A wood nymph named Friday, who predates Navi from The Legend of Zelda by 6 years, comes flying up begging Nigel for help. I feel I must sidetrack us for a minute here.
Here we go again.
As it's important that I clarify that I love The Legend of Zelda. In fact, the Hero of Time Link from the Ocarina of Time is by far one of my all-time favorite video game heroes ever. So much so that I did a video on this channel talking about how the Hero of Time is probably the epitome of a hero. Card for that here just in case y'all don't mind another shameless plug. So when it seems like I'm taking a jab by saying Friday, a seemingly fey companion who was showcased in Landstalker before Ocarina of Time's Navi, that's not meant to be a shot across the bow for Legend of Zelda. While fairies weren't new to The Legend of Zelda, the mechanic of a fairy companion wouldn't come to fruition until Ocarina of Time as far as The Legend of Zelda is concerned. Meanwhile, Landstalker did it 6 years prior, as stated before, which only shows yet another innovation in Landstalker's narrative, and we haven't even gotten to its game mechanics yet. And now, back to our scheduled program. So Friday is being chased by another treasure hunter named Kayla, and her two monstrous companions, Ink and Wally. You know, Ink and Wally remind me of characters that a 3.5 edition D&D player created using the Savage Species book, with the sole purpose of playing them as bumbling as possible for comic relief. I just thought I'd point that out as well. Nigel agrees to help Friday when he learns that Friday knows the location of the fabled treasure of King Noel. So without hesitation of the dangers that lay ahead,
consequences, schmonsequences, as long as I'm rich.
Nigel spends the last of his gold, or at least a good chunk of it, to fly to Gola Island. The giant bird, which I think is an eagle, is wearing flight goggles also. And it's just little touches like this that makes me love Landstalker. I mean, it just cracks me up the way it looks. Now, I don't want to spoil the game completely, as it's my ardent wish that any of you Golden Wonders out there who haven't played Landstalker will go out and play it for yourselves. It's only 99 cents on Steam, but if that's too pricey,
You serious?
then I still urge you to play it by any means necessary. Landstalker's gameplay was way ahead of its time, but whether or not it was truly the first to implement the three-dimensional platforming style of play it's known for, I can't honestly say. But what I will say is that when I first discovered Landstalker on the Sega channel,
I'm Chanel. And I'm Channel.
I hadn't personally played anything like it yet. I've heard it called an isometric view, which is also known as an isometric projection. This is where 3D objects are represented on a two-dimensional plane. And yes, it is more nuanced than that, but I'm a knucklehead. So I'm explaining it in the simplest of terms, more for me than the audience. Good for all of you aerospace engineers out there who understand the math.
Check out the big brain on Brad.
JK, I love y'all. This isometric view is, however, one of the game's biggest weaknesses as well, as it can be a bit disorienting. Not taking away from the innovation, of course, the said isometric view can make certain areas of the platforming hard to gauge. Now, to be fair, I suck at video games. I'm just passionate about the games I love. And there were times while getting the footage for this video that I about lost my religion. There are times that the depth perception can be wonky, and I swear I would jump from one spot to the other, 100% certain that I was dead on, only to realize that the unmoving platform I was jumping to isn't sitting along the wall, which in turn would cause me to miss it on the inside of the wall, plunging me down into some kind of spiked flooring or room full of death mummies, for example. If that sounds like a convoluted explanation, that's because I don't know any better way of explaining it. Basically, in most platforming games, if a platform is running alongside the wall, then the wall acts as a barrier, with the outside edge being the death trap. Landstalker, though, doesn't do that. See, the developers in their infinite wisdom thought it'd be cool to make it where you can fall off the platform on either side. Not that this doesn't have a certain level of realism to it, and I honestly respect its hustle, but because the view is isometric, the depth perception can be misleading, causing one to learn about this mechanic the hard way. Now, I know that it sounds like I'm only whining, but you gotta hand it to Climax for pushing the limits of Sega's controls. In the end, this style would become the norm for platforming games, save for the Metrovania side-scrolling platformers. But even they incorporate these mechanics to a degree at times. I just don't think the Genesis was quite equipped for something of Landstalker's type at the time. Regardless, Landstalker is a critical darling and remembered kindly by its players. Another cool mechanic is the fighting, as Landstalker goes with a real-time fights over the typical turn-based fighting structure often used by RPGs during the time. The Final Fantasy series, that was known for its innovative turn-based combat, has moved away from turn-based combat, adopting the more real-time action strategy combat that Landstalker was already doing. But so did Beyond Oasis and The Legend of Zelda, not to mention The Secret of Mana. Oh yeah, speaking of Final Fantasy, Sweet Baby Inc. Leave Tifa alone. Why do you guys hate beauty so much? Tifa. If I may get sidetracked again, A Link to the Past did a good job at the real-time fighting combat, but to say that Nintendo did it better than Landstalker is like comparing apples and oranges. I can honestly say Landstalker did it better than Beyond Oasis or Secret of Mana, but it's a funny argument comparing it to A Link to the Past, and I'll tell you why. Sure, A Link to the Past has Landstalker technically beat by 1 year when it comes to release dates, there's no evidence that says Landstalker drew any influence from A Link to the Past in using the real-time strategy combat. Their aesthetics are pretty similar, yeah, but if you ask me, Landstalker might have influenced The Legend of Zelda in some ways also, maybe even more so. I'm getting ahead of myself though, so before we even delve into all that, let's just say that when you play A Link to the Past, it's top-down view, making it real-time combat, I won't say easier, but more easy to visualize. So one can't really compare isometric real-time combat to top-down view combat, if that makes any sense, and then argue the case of which is better. Anyways, going back to who drew more inspiration from who, well, Landstalker's main protagonist Nigel is definitely inspired by Link. I would say a lot of characters were inspired by Link in this time. I'd also say the whole style and vibe of Landstalker was meant to be a response to Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda. But I'd also say that Landstalker had a few things that had to have inspired future installments of The Legend of Zelda. We've already talked about Friday being a Fey companion that came before Navi from the Ocarina of Time, but Landstalker also had a mechanic that I believe inspired the Great Deku Tree from the Ocarina of Time.
No way!
So I know this is perhaps a grand assumption, and maybe even a grander statement, but first allow me to explain the order of Zelda games by release dates. The first two installments were released in 1986, then 1987, only 1 year apart from each other. A Link to the Past wouldn't come out until 1991, with the next game, Link's Awakening, releasing in 93 for the Game Boy. In 98, both Link's Awakening for Game Boy Color would drop, but so would also Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64. Now, all you Golden Wonders out there might be asking, why is any of that matter? Does Pog even have a point here?
You bet your sweet bippy!
I admit it's not terribly weird that Nintendo made sure to release a Zelda game for every launch of a new system, so the time periods do make some sense up until Ocarina of Time. Nintendo were more than pleased with the success of A Link to the Past, so the idea of releasing another Zelda game on the SNES probably didn't even occur to them, which just means that Nintendo were happy with their results. They were sitting on top of the mountain at this time, so they didn't think that they needed to really give us more Zelda, if that makes any sense. Yet, they didn't even begin to feel the squeeze by Sega. So, if just feeling a slight discomfort as a result meant anything to them, we wouldn't know. The misconception here, though, is that it wasn't Nintendo that would cause Sega to go from being publishers to developers. That wasn't Nintendo's fault. By the time the 64 hit the shelves, they were faced with a new challenger in the console wars, in the form of Sony's PlayStation. The Nintendo 64 was vastly inferior to the PS1.
Does your depravity know no bounds?
No.
Which might not be a popular statement, but that doesn't make it any less true. In Nintendo's infinite wisdom, they began throwing all their most popular IPs at the 64 just to keep up with the PS1. Now all of a sudden, making more Zelda games, more Mario games, and the like were now a big priority to Nintendo, because now they couldn't just rest on their morals, if you will, their past victories. Metroid, of course, wouldn't get a release for the 64, and it has been stated by Yoshio Sakamoto, who at the time had been involved with the development of several Metroid games. He felt that the 64 wouldn't suit a Metroid game. The quirks of the console and the control being just weird to him, he didn't think Metroid was a good fit. Now that's not to say that the 64 didn't have hits on the platform, one of them being The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time. And probably the best Legend of Zelda game there ever was, you know? Fight me. No, really though. And as much as I love that game and the Hero of Time, I know that Landstalker had to have helped inspired it, because the PS1 was comfortably stomping a mud hole in the 64. Nintendo now couldn't afford to rest on the success of their past successes. Say that 5 times fast. They needed a win, and as such it was time to blow the dust off The Legend of Zelda, hence the gap between The Link to the Past and the Ocarina of Time. Now they had to start pumping out their IPs. And up until now, Nintendo had been king of the hill, but no more. So like I said, Friday is one indication, but another is the Great Deku Tree, and where Nintendo drew inspiration from Landstalker. One of the major gameplay mechanics of Landstalker is the tree stands, which Landstalker incorporates in a very clever way. First off, a player can go through the entire game without even knowing about the tree stands, as Landstalker doesn't exactly hold the player's hand in guiding them to these tree stands. There are clues to indicate that the first tree stand Nigel comes upon is there, but never is there really any indication that he should even notice it in the first place. Besides all that, even if the player directs Nigel to the first tree stand, Landstalker chooses to treat it as a mystery. There's other clues later on that passively state that there's more to these trees than meets the eye.
Autobots, roll out!
Yet none of this will mean anything until Nigel finds the one tree stand who has an actual face and can talk to you. This one tree stand with the face tells Nigel that his insides feel sick, and the player can choose to go inside the tree to help clean it. This will reward the player with a teleport mechanic that from now on he can use any tree stand as long as they're matching as a means of warping across the game map, cutting Nigel's travel time in half, in some instances. The catch is that each tree has a twin, and the player must find both twins to unlock the warps they provide. To put it in layman's terms, each stand only warps to one specific location, so it's not a license to bounce around the map. My question to you, my golden wonders out there, is thus: does any of what I just described about the tree stands sound familiar? While I would be amiss to say that Link's relationship with the Great Deku Tree isn't one of the most pivotal, nay, one of the most emotional moments of Ocarina of Time, and it's really at the very beginning, no less. The parallels between Nigel meeting the tree stand with a face and Link's quest to rid the Great Deku Tree of his curse are too similar to be coincidence. Yes, Ocarina of Time has way more gravitas in this story plot, but if I'm being honest, Landstalker did it first. So moving along from that, Landstalker's way of leveling Nigel up is odd to me. As in, I can't be for sure if I'm correct on how Nigel levels up. Meaning, the player has to collect what is called livestock that adds hearts to Nigel's HP, which is obviously an influence from The Legend of Zelda, so, you know, there you go. These hearts, though, are what is initially Nigel's health. Now, to me, it feels like the more livestock Nigel has, the stronger he's becoming. Granted, he can take more damage, but it kind of feels like his damage output increases also. Eventually, enemies Nigel used to have to hit a few times die in one hit, like the clear bubbles at the very beginning. The first kind of enemy you really have to fight. But that could be because of his equipment also. There are 4 types of swords Nigel can obtain, each doing their own form of elemental damage: fire, ice, electricity, terra. These are neat because they don't just allow for elemental damage on a consistent basis, but have to charge up first. There's a sword indicator in the top left corner that slowly loads an elemental charge, but resets every time Nigel swings his sword, which means that the player shouldn't just swing their sword all willy-nilly, but time their attack so as not to waste a charge, because if you swing at nothing, it resets the charge, and you've wasted all that wait time. Nigel will also get better armor, boots, and rings that will give him an edge while dungeon diving, along with traversing the dangerous island in of itself. There are other items that cure ailments and restore health, but mostly all the rest of the items the player gains are purely situational. Some will only be important maybe once, while others will have lasting effects like the dog whistle. Saving game progress mirrors Shining Force, as the player has to visit a priest to do so, but instead of simply speaking with the priest, Nigel has to pick up a book and set it on the priest's podium. There are several types of books Nigel can choose to give the priest that can cure the various types of status effects that act as ailments to Nigel. Plus, this mechanic is used for purchasing items in stores, staying at inns for the night to restore HP, and looking at a world map. Also, not to mention that Landstalker is a healthy mixture of combat, platforming, and exploration. There are a lot of puzzles in Landstalker, and I can't stress this enough, but the game does not hold the player's hand. So allow me this one contrivance as I make my one real legitimate complaint. There's a dungeon where Nigel gets transformed into a dog, which is fine because it's a pretty neat little side quest that isn't necessary to finishing the game, but I highly suggest doing it. Which puts me in a conundrum because it does probably have one of the most awful puzzles ever. The player is required to ride these marbles to activate switches, but because of Landstalker's wonky controlling, it's enough to make newcomers to the game rage quit. Be warned about this dungeon. I highly suggest that if anyone can't get past this at first, don't quit Landstalker forever. Just walk away for a while.
Stop it. Get some help.
Maybe go outside, touch grass, walk the dog, ride a bike, go on a date. Whatever you do, don't give up though, because Landstalker really is worth the effort. Plus, the reward for finishing this side quest is faster recharge of weaponry, so it's worth it in the end. So far, I've talked about the history, story, and gameplay of Landstalker.
But wait! There's more!
Yet, I couldn't end this review without talking about the music, as there are a few bangers offered up by Mototaki Takenouchi. I've talked in length about Yuzo Koshiro in the past, who, without a doubt, is the Mozart of video game music. But I feel what Motoaki Takenouchi, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, sorry, did with Landstalker is too integral not to speak on it. For starters, the score Takenouchi did for the tree stands area is yet another example of something I think Nintendo used when developing The Lost Woods in Ocarina of Time, which subsequently is tied into the Deco Tree in that game. Music plays such a big role in The Lost Woods, and the music used for when Nigel encounters the tree stands is one of Landstalker's most memorable tracks. So just listen. Ocarina of Time uses a heavy amount of upbeat tempo and flute in The Lost Woods, just like Landstalker, and it's too noticeable how similar they are when one is familiar with both games. Just listen to The Lost Woods here. Are they exactly the same? Well, no, but they are spiritual cousins to be sure. Another great track from Takenouchi is the map section. When Nigel puts a map on the counter of a shop, the player gets to see their location on Gola Island for free. I briefly mentioned this mechanic in the gameplay section, but it's the music here that I want to really speak on. It's such a spectacular little track that starts off with these high notes then goes into this light tempo only to hit this high epic crescendo. I just love it. I could go to sleep with it on a loop, I swear. So just listen to this for yourselves. Lastly, I want to talk about what is probably the most important song in the whole game, and that's Ludwig's Sonata, or Love Theme. Ludwig is an NPC in the game, who's in love with a princess that mysteriously disappears, leaving Ludwig heartbroken. In his despair for the loss of his love, he writes this song for her, which doubles as a pivotal transitional moment for Nigel. See, up until this point, Nigel is just a boy. I know that I said I couldn't be sure if he was a boy earlier, but I know he's a boy. I know this because one of the quests in the game before this moment states as much. Sure, he's an accomplished treasure hunter, which is no small feat for a child, but I get the distinct feeling that the Gypta Ruins job is in no way as treacherous as what he's gone through while being on Gola Island. In fact, it vaguely hinted at that this is probably the biggest job he's ever gone on, which is why this moment when he listens to Ludwig's Sonata while attending Duke Mercator's banquet is such a turning point for him. Nigel has now earned the acknowledgement of major figures like the Duke. He's braved extremely difficult dungeons for being only just a boy, and now he stands among two other renowned hunters. I believe this moment illustrates that moment when a child goes from being a youth to an adult, which is why the melody is both somber but beautiful at the same time. Ludwig wrote it to express the loss of his love, but for the player and Nigel, it represents the loss of his childhood, as he is now a man, and the road ahead is only going to get more perilous, much like adulthood. If I were to give this song a title, I would call it Ludwig's Last Lullaby. But alas, it's actually called A Ballad for Princess Loria. For any of you Golden Wonders out there who want to look it up, that's what it's actually called. I'm going to play the ballad in full here. I know I cut the others off short for copyright purposes, but if I get a claim here, well, y'all are worth it. So enjoy. Motoaki Tanuchi knew what he was doing here with this one piece, and I salute him for it. Thank you, Mr. Tanuchi, for creating a song that even to this day still gives me goosebumps and draws emotions and memories of a time when I was young and the world was still full of wonder out of me. This song will always be memorable for me, and I hope it will be for all of you out there who honor me with your presence as well. And that's all she wrote for Landstalker, The Treasures of King Noel. I hope y'all enjoyed my review, and to those of you who have been lifelong fans of this game, I sincerely hope I did it justice in your eyes. The next R&R that I'm going to do will be the final review of this 4-part Best RPGs released by Sega for the Genesis. And even though it isn't my personal favorite of this series, it's hard not to say that it wasn't the best RPG Sega ever made for the Genesis. But y'all will just have to stay tuned and see what game it is. If you like what I did here, please leave a like on the video. And if you didn't like it, then I'm truly humbled that you stayed for the whole thing. If you're new here, then I'd be honored if you'd subscribe. Don't forget to share the video, ring my bell for notifications, sign my guest book letting me know your thoughts, as everyone's voice here is welcome, regardless if we always agree or not. Y'all are important, and I mean this with my heart and soul when I say I love you. Y'all come back now, and stay golden.